Our scripture this morning is from Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 through 16 and 27, 1 through 10. And I actually shortened this because it was really long reading this morning. So I'm giving us just the parts that I wanted to focus on. One of the 12, the one named Judas Iscariot, went off to the chief priest and said, "What are you willing to give me if I hand Jesus over to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he looked for an opportunity to betray Jesus. At daybreak, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took formal action against Jesus to put him to death. They bound him and led him away to be handed over to Pilate, the governor. When he saw that Jesus had been condemned, Judas, who had betrayed Jesus, felt remorse. He took the 30 pieces of silver back to the chief priests and elders and said, "I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood." "What's that to us?" they answered. "That's your affair." So Judas flung the money into the sanctuary and left. Then he went off and hanged himself. The chief priest picked up the silver, observing, "It's against the law to deposit this in the temple treasury, since it is blood money." After some discussion, they used the money to buy Potter's Field as a cemetery for foreigners. That is why that field, even today, is called Blood Field. On that occasion, what was said through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took 30 pieces of silver, the price for the one whose price was set by the children of Israel. And they paid it out for Potter's Field, just as the Most High commanded me. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If you would, please pray with me. Gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you this day, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So about 10 years ago, I participated in a book study where we read Sue Monk Kidd's When the Heart Waits. It's a book about spiritual direction and our most sacred questions. Kidd used familiar fairy tale characters to illuminate character traits that we all possess, some to a greater degree than others, and discussed at length how we can integrate our lives towards wholeness. Part of the process of becoming all that we can be is recognizing that often we have to wait for revelation. Kidd describes this waiting as being both passive and passionate. She goes on to say that waiting means descending into self, into God, into the deeper labyrinths of prayer. It involves listening to disinherited voices within, facing the wounded holes in the soul, the denied and undiscovered places one lives falsely. Only then are we able to hear the sheer eloquence of life's ability to speak to us. It is the experience of incubating what needs to be born. How does this process work if you are in the actual presence of Jesus and he is telling you that he knows the intentions of your heart? It is as if there are two processes going on at all times, both of which we are sort of unaware. One, the idea that going deeper, one of incubating until that which we were meant to be is born, and two, that of recognizing that which already exists within us and is now manifest through our actions. I've never been fond of anyone trying to read my thoughts, but there are those moments when it is far more evident to others of how I am going to behave, as if my body is sending out some signal not detected by me of what is to come. Sometimes we can see this as a cause and effect kind of thing, but often there isn't any precipitating event just behavior we didn't expect that others saw coming from a mile away. This is the case with Jesus and his disciples. He reads their hearts. Peter is completely caught off guard by Jesus' accusations that he will deny Jesus 3 times. We read this and in some ways dismiss the significance of Peter's denial because we see the difficult situation in which Peter is placed and want to forgive him for being so short-sighted. In fact, Jesus tells them all that they will flee. And they all deny such action. Again, though, we give them all a pass because we can connect with their humanness. We see how afraid they all were at the thought of being imprisoned or put to death by Roman soldiers. It is Judas, though, with which we have the most difficulty. Judas did the unspeakable. He betrayed Jesus, which cost Jesus his life. Or at least that is how we have always been taught to read this story. Every one of the disciples acted out of self-interest on the night of the Passover meal. Even after Jesus lowers himself to the position of a slave by washing the disciples' feet, the disciples were unable to stand with him as one convicted of treasonous behavior. We could all condemn the actions of the disciples, or we could acknowledge that the incubation period for the disciples was not yet over. It was actually through this passage that I began to see kids' notion of incubation through a different lens. All things need time to become fully manifest. If we were born knowing all that we needed to know, or even able to do all that we would ever need to do, the process of learning, the very act of discovery, would be completely eliminated from our lives. In this way, we would never have to experience the emotional upheaval that comes from not getting it right the first, second, or even third time. Or of disappointing family and friends when we make huge mistakes. Or of experiencing the unforgettable joy of seeing the sun rise over the ocean or set over the mountains. All of our experiences are part of this incubation period, a period that hopefully lasts a lifetime. Ultimately, incubation is about our willingness to discover the unknown of ourselves, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then to do something with it. I can imagine that after Jesus was arrested and all the disciples fled, that their worst nightmare was quickly realized. Jesus' prediction had come true. And for Judas, this was particularly heartbreaking. All my life, I have been taught that Judas was the betrayer. Judas went to the high priest and asked the all-important question, "What are you willing to give me if I hand Jesus over to you?" This question has often confused me. It almost as if the Sanhedrin, the collective religious leaders for the Jewish people, didn't really know Jesus. Or at a minimum, the highest ranking members of the Sanhedrin didn't know Jesus. What makes this odd is that in Matthew in particular, we see Jesus' interactions with the religious leaders more than ever. He rails against the Sadducees and the Pharisees repeatedly, reminding the people to not follow their example. He is in direct opposition to the Sanhedrin at every turn. Still, Judas makes the offer, and I've always wondered why. Being painted as one who is self-serving, one who seeks out money to betray a friend, the one who just hours earlier shared in the bread and the wine of the Passover meal with Jesus, doesn't leave much room for us to see Judas any other way. It is only after Jesus has been condemned to death that we see a glimpse into a different part of the character of Judas. He shows remorse. He states, I have sinned, I have betrayed innocent blood. And it is here that I began to understand what was so distant from me at first. Judas, like all of us, believed in a cause. He was Jewish. He followed the law. He wanted to do the right thing. But he got caught up in something that he didn't entirely understand. I believe that Judas thought he was doing the right thing even for the right reason. Maybe he began to see Jesus as operating outside the prescribed lines for someone who is often called rabbi or teacher. What Judas discovers, though, is that perhaps there is a disconnect between his own understanding of what was going to happen to Jesus and what actually ends up happening to Jesus. Judas may be categorized as one who is self-serving, but it might be more accurate to classify him as one who is self-sustaining. It is in this moment of realization, recognizing he has betrayed innocent blood, that we see Judas emerge differently from how we imagined him. Someone who is remorseful. If Judas was cold-hearted and only out for himself, then he would not have cared whether Jesus was innocent or not. The only thing that would have mattered to him was the payoff. That isn't what we see in the text. We see a man who is caught between two worlds, both of which he believes strongly. I'm not certain at all that Judas had any idea what the Sanhedrin planned to do with Jesus after he was arrested. When Jesus speaks of Jesus' innocence, we can only wonder what Judas is referring to. If the charge was sedition, conduct or speech inciting the Jewish people to rebel against the Sanhedrin, then in many ways Jesus was guilty, but with good cause. We are never really told what his official charges are, only that he must be executed for his crime. How many times do we act out of self-preservation, only to have it look like self-serving behavior? I think that Judas is a misunderstood figure. I think he gets a bad rap. And there's always the question, what if Judas had not fulfilled his destiny? Jesus predicted Judas's behavior at Passover, just like he predicted all the other disciples' behavior. Was there any way for Judas to escape this path, or was he bound to it in some way? How can you condemn someone for all eternity if you have destined them to play a particular role? Or do we still have a choice? I think that Sue Monk Kidd comes close to helping us answer these important questions. Judas was as much a victim of his own process as he was of the Sanhedrin. It was unfortunate that Judas was unable to reconcile the disinherited voices that he believed to be right. Judas was trapped between that, what he believed to be right, the law, and what he saw Jesus doing, living the law. They were contradictory in his mind. Instead of descending into his self to discover where he was living falsely and feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, or taking care of widows and orphans, he gets caught up in the doctrine of it all. This is our present day circumstance as well. Instead of seeking out how we live falsely, we stand behind doctrine that has outlived its usefulness. We say to ourselves that this doctrine is tradition and therefore has much to offer us. We research the doctrine to discover the truth of our lives. But the truth of our lives isn't discovered in some abstract concept spelled out in doctrinal language. The truth of ourselves can only be discovered when we are willing to look deep at who we are. Without our own incubation process, we never reach the place of tearing down the facades that we have built up over the years. I'm convinced that we cannot hear what life has to offer us, what God is trying to show us, if we are clinging to our doctrinal views in a way that chokes out life. If there's any doubt that Judas was trapped by the law, we only need to read further in the text. After returning the silver and denouncing his actions, the chief priest declares that according to the law, the silver cannot be deposited in the treasury because it is blood money. There's a subtle but pervasive connection between the letter of the law and self-serving behavior. The letter of the law allows us to be selective about what we do and who we do it with. But the spirit of the law that Jesus lived by, calls us to destroy the boundaries that keep us separated from others and from ourselves. We can no longer compartmentalize our lives in such a way that we are immune to the effects of our actions. Judas certainly wasn't immune, and neither are we. It is imperative, and I use that word, it's a very strong word, but it is imperative that we take time for introspection, that we look deep into our hearts and examine who we are in light of Jesus. We can hold on to church doctrine, our form of church law, or we can set ourselves free to follow the tenets of Jesus' teachings. To remain trapped is to die. To discover Christ is to live. May it be so. Amen.